Thank you, Dylan, for that incredible poem. When I heard that I was going to be following Dylan Garrity, I cheered and groaned simultaneously. I'm sure everybody has had this experience. I cheered because I've watched him on YouTube perform that multiple times. My kids have watched him. And when I told my kids that I was going to be following up Dylan Garrity, my status at home went up enormously. I groaned because you can't follow up an act like that. And at the same time, what Dylan has illustrated is what language is capable of communicating. He's illustrated just how powerful language can be in picking out reality and making us see things that we haven't seen before. That poem, and obviously others that he has written and performed, should be on the curriculum for every child in this country and beyond. It's an example of powerful use of language. And the theme of what I want to talk about is we need to enable all students to engage in powerful uses of language, because those powerful uses of language are identity affirming. And if students do not feel that their identities are validated in the school, they will withdraw, they will disengage, and eventually, as Dylan pointed out, they will drop out. So let me just give you an overview of the issues that I want to talk about. But first, let me thank CABE again for the opportunity to be here. It's an incredible honor for me to be part of the 40th anniversary celebrations. As I said before, I've grown up academically with CABE. There are many friends here that have had a huge influence on my thinking, on my work, and I just want to acknowledge that debt that I owe many people in this room. So just to give you an overview of the issues that I want to talk about. The era of No Child Left Behind, in other words, over the last 15 or so years at the federal level, has been characterized by the dominance of ideological narratives over empirical research. Now, there's nothing wrong with ideologies. Everybody in this room shares an ideology that children deserve an equitable education. Everybody in this room shares an ideology that children's talents should be nurtured. Ideologies become problematic only when they become unhinged from the research data. And unfortunately, many aspects of No Child Left Behind, despite its admirable intentions, are dramatically unhinged from the research data. And so I want to just talk a little bit about that, because educators over the last 15 years have been dealing with all kinds of contradictions. As Dylan pointed out, children who've been in this country for 1 year are expected to perform at native-like levels in terms of English academic proficiency, despite the fact that all of the research shows that typically at least 5 years is required for students to catch up. And what frustrates me enormously is that there is no ability to discuss this with people who are implementing these policies. They refuse to engage in rational discussion because the ideological narrative is so strong. So I'll talk a little bit about that just to set a context. No Child Left Behind has also been characterized by the extensive use, the dramatic increase in the use of standardized tests. When you look at the research on standardized tests, for example, research carried out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which is a major economic think tank, they say, hey, there's no evidence that standardized tests have any contribution to academic achievement. And yet we continue to do it as if there was some rationale and some evidence for it. But what I think we see at this point is a shift. I think enough people in this country have seen the disastrous effects of the policies that we've implemented at a federal level over the last 15 years or so, and before that. And we've been fighting back to develop policies that have much more rational basis, are much more grounded in the research. The California State Seal of Biliteracy is one example of an initiative that is fully rooted in the research dealing with the effects of bilingualism, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And so I think we've reached a tipping point where there's the potential to get education back on a rational track And the upcoming challenge to Proposition 227 is another example of that. But in order to close the achievement gap, we've got to ground our policies and practice rigorously in the research evidence regarding, first of all, the causes of underachievement. What do we know about why children underachieve? And instructional approaches that respond directly to these underlying causes. I'll try to focus on issues that have not been picked up in the research or in the policies to this point. So I'll try and reflect on where we've been and then say where we need to go. Just to give you a couple of examples, and I'll elaborate on these in my session after the plenary. But as I said, there's no evidence that standardized tests improve achievement or close the gap between social groups. When we look at reading instruction, the thrust in terms of No Child Left Behind has been on providing all children with systematic, intensive phonics instruction. Phonics instruction, I think, is important. But when we look at what the research says, after grade 1, phonics instruction is unrelated to reading comprehension for low-achieving and normally achieving students. I'm not just making this up. This is what the National Reading Panel found. But this finding was dramatically suppressed in terms of the way policymakers and some researchers interpreted it, because the ideological narrative was so strong that phonics was key. And when we look at what does influence reading engagement, what does influence reading comprehension, the strongest predictor of reading comprehension is the amount of reading engagement that students engage in. That's something that probably many in this room have not heard. And yet it has huge implications for how we view reading instruction, particularly for students who may not have extensive access to printed text and books in their homes. And then, as I said, when we look at the ELL or EL catch-up trajectories, the research shows at least 5 years is typically required, and yet No Child Left Behind penalizes schools if students have not caught up within 1 year. Imagine what this does for the morale of teachers. If you're teaching in a school with large numbers of English learners, and these students have not caught up within 1 year, No Child Left Behind says they haven't caught up because you're a lousy teacher and you're in a lousy school. And that is dramatically unethical. And so we have to call the lack of attention to the research, the lack of willingness to engage with the research, what it is. It is unethical. Okay. So if we look at how we move towards evidence-based policymaking as opposed to evidence-free policymaking, we've got to ask, first of all, which groups of students underachieve? Okay, everybody in this room is concerned with English learners, with bilingual students who are coming to school with limited knowledge of the language of instruction. We know that there are initiatives that we can take that can help those students succeed. Where bilingual education is feasible, the research shows that is by far the best option. But we also know that all teachers in the school need to know how to scaffold instruction for students. They need to know how to teach language across the curriculum, reinforce language across the curriculum. California has had initiatives in this regard over a number of years, but in terms of the priority given to those policies, they've gone up and down with the political waves. We've got to understand why students underachieve, what causal factors are operating. So I'm going to basically say that there are 3 groups of students that are characterized by underachievement to a greater or lesser extent in different contexts. We have students from English learning backgrounds who are coming to school not knowing the language of instruction. If the school does nothing to help those students, as the Lau versus Nichols judgment pointed out, these students will probably not succeed academically. Then we have students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, students who are growing up in poverty, students whose parents may not have money to buy books, to buy iPads, to buy the things that many of us in this room take for granted with our own kids. These students, in many countries, show much less strong achievement trajectories in comparison to students from middle-class backgrounds. we've got to ask, what can schools do to address that? Is it possible for us to push back some of those negative effects of socioeconomic status? And then we have students from what I'll call marginalized social groups. Other terms have been used, racialized social groups, students who've been on the wrong end of coercive power relations over generations, or whose communities have been on the wrong end. These are students in this country. We're all familiar with groups that tend not to do well academically: African American students, many Latina students, Native American students, have all been characterized by underachievement over many generations. In many cases, these three categories will be joined in one student. One student will fall into all three of these categories. They'll be coming to school not knowing the language of instruction, they're coming from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and they're coming from groups that have been discriminated against over generations. And so we can look at the evidence that's out there, and there's a lot of evidence out there in terms of what will help these students succeed academically, what we can do. So let me just talk, that's sort of the general direction that I want to go in. Let's talk about ideologies for a moment, because what you're seeing there is an ideology that I came across in Sao Paulo in Brazil. This gentleman was walking the streets, and I'm not sure if you can see it or not, but he has his invocation to pay attention to our lives and to believe in the Lord, written in about 6 or 7 different languages there. Obviously, part of his ideology could be seen as multilingualism being a gateway to heaven, or the stairway to heaven. A very different ideology is evident in some of the demonstrations that have happened in this country. These are 2 photographs that were taken of people who were protesting against things like bilingual education and diversity and immigration. If you look closely, you may see that there's not necessarily a high level of literacy involved there. So the ideology here is multilingualism is a threat to national unity. Just to kind of highlight what I'm saying here, the normal assumption that naive researchers like myself, or when I was young and ignorant, I had the idea that research had a direct relationship to policy. The researchers go out and collect the data, give them to policymakers, and policymakers act in rational ways. Okay, I've grown up since then. The typical policy making is one where research is always filtered through an ideological lens. Policymakers will cherry pick what research looks good for them, and they will ignore what isn't. And this applies beyond education. It applies, if you look at the history of research on the effects of smoking. You can see the arguments that tobacco companies made, which they claimed were based in the research, to avoid limiting the sale of cigarettes. So this is the typical reality. And as I said, ideologies are not problematic in themselves. It's only when they become unhinged from the research data. And so if we want to engage in a rational, evidence-based policymaking process, we've got to do the research, we've got to interpret the research in terms of theoretical suppositions. What's the bulk of the research saying? What are the principles underlying this pattern of findings? And then that's what has an impact on policy. And I'll try and illustrate that in terms of my involvement with CABE and with education in California over the years. But a fundamental principle that I'd like to get out here, that I think undercuts everything that this organization stands for, and that the research that I've tried to interpret points towards, is that if you want students to emerge from schooling after 12 years as intelligent, imaginative, and linguistically talented, then treat them as intelligent, imaginative, and linguistically talented from the first day they arrive in school. It's not rocket science. And yet, when we look at what happened under No Child Left Behind, what's still happening under No Child Left Behind, where the power of those standardized tests is so great that teachers can not only lose money, if their children don't perform well. Schools can be shut down. Principals and teachers can lose their job. This has all happened. And so the result of that, and this has been documented in California, it's been documented elsewhere, is that there's been an increase in the pedagogical divide between the kind of instruction that many students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds get and that which, and the instruction that students from more affluent backgrounds get. There's a much greater likelihood that students who are not at risk of failing the test will get the opportunity to engage in inquiry-oriented learning. They'll carry out projects. They'll use technology in creative ways. There's some wonderful things happening. Unfortunately, with students who are at risk of failing the test for whatever reason, whether they're coming from a lower socioeconomic background because they don't understand the language of instruction when they come to school, whatever the reason is, what has happened is a narrowing of the curriculum. In some cases, recess has been cancelled. We've had much more drill and practice oriented towards test preparation activities. And students are getting a much more anemic education than their peers a few miles down the road who are growing up in more affluent areas. And so what this principle is saying is that in school, a major aspect of what we're talking about when we talk about education is a process of negotiating identities. And if we're talking about students who are coming from communities whose identities, whose culture, whose language, whose religion in some cases has been devalued over generations, then it's incumbent on the school to challenge that pattern of coercive relations of power and to create opportunities for students to use language in powerful ways that will affirm their identities and showcase their imagination, showcase their linguistic talents, showcase their intelligence. And so we have to challenge the very foundations of No Child Left Behind. No Child Left Behind right now is going through a reauthorization process. Presumably, there'll be some fixes made, but the fixes I think that are required are much more fundamental. And I'll try and elaborate on that later on. So if students' bilingual and multilingual accomplishments are seldom acknowledged or fostered in the school, students will not see themselves as linguistically talented and will devalue their linguistic accomplishments. And for the students who are in schools where bilingual education is not being implemented, it's not possible, this has been the norm rather than the exception. So if we go back to, I guess, my original growing up with CABE, my original development of some of these ideas, the first major project that I was involved in California was helping to create the theoretical framework for education of English learners in the state. It was called Schooling and Language Minority Students, the Theoretical Framework. Some of the people whose work was reflected in this, whose initiative, whose drive and talent went into creating this are down at the bottom. Steve Krashen and I were asked to write theoretical papers looking at what we know about English language learning on Steve's part, what we know about the role of students' first language, primary language on my part. Steve unpacked the notion of comprehensible input, and what I tried to do was to elaborate on what I'd call the interdependence hypothesis, focusing on the fact that languages are not separate at a deeper level. At an academic level, they're interdependent, or there's considerable overlap across languages. And this permits cross-lingual transfer, which enables students in bilingual programs to catch up academically. So try to explain why it was that students who might spend 50% of their time in a bilingual program, say a Spanish-speaking student student from a Spanish-speaking home background in a Spanish-English bilingual program, they didn't lose out in English, despite the fact that they were spending half their time through Spanish. In fact, as we know from a lot of recent research, by the end of elementary schools, they're pulling ahead. How can that be? How can less equal more? How can less English instruction lead to greater English achievement? The interdependence idea tried to explain that. So if we look at some of the original claims that were embedded in that theoretical framework, how do some of those claims hold up? I'll just talk about some of the things that I tried to address in my original paper. I made a distinction between basic interpersonal communicative skills and cognitive academic language proficiency, or BICS and CALP. I tend to use the terms conversational fluency and academic language proficiency these days. This was a controversial decision. It got attacked right, left, and center, but it's still out there. I think few researchers doubt the basic distinction. They may object to the way it was described, but few doubt the basic distinction between conversational and academic language. For example, this is embedded in the Common Core State Standards, which focuses directly on how schools can develop students' academic language proficiency. There's also, as I said before, a clear research basis from many countries validating the catch-up trajectories for English learners in terms of their academic language catch-up, showing that we're looking typically at least 5 years. Another point that was made, well, let me just show you some data relating to that. This was the original study that I was able to do as a reanalysis of data from the Toronto Board of Education, which showed the type of catch-up trajectory we were looking for. LOR there stands for length of residence. And so down at the bottom there, you've got 3 groups of students who arrived in Canada, arrived in the Toronto Board between the ages of 10 and 11 to 14, 15. And it showed how close they were, or how far away they were from grade means. And you can see that they were between 1.5 and 2 standard deviations below the mean. So the equivalent of about 22, 23 standard score points. After 3 years, they were about 1 standard deviation below the mean, or 15 IQ type points. And so it was between 5 and 7 years that it took them to come close to grade norms. Not quite catch up, but come close. And these data have been validated in many, many respects. One of the, I guess, most comprehensive studies was one done in California subsequent to the passage of Proposition 227, where Parrish and her colleagues showed that after 3 years of English-only instruction, only 12% of English learners in California had sufficient academic English to be redesignated as English proficient. And so the basis for Proposition 227 was that 1 year of intensive exposure to English is all students need, they'll catch up. Like, that is absurd. And yet, it is still out there in terms of No Child Left Behind. And at some point, we've got to stand up and say, this emperor has no clothes. Like, we talk about people who are skeptical of bilingual education, wondering how long it takes kids to learn English. Well, how long does it take policymakers who've been to some of the best universities in this world to figure out this? These data are from 1980. They're 35 years old. A second point that I tried to make in the original paper was that there was a considerable amount of data showing that bilingualism was a cognitive advantage. Since that time, particularly over the last 15 years, as researchers, neurolinguists, and others have been able to peer into students' brains or individuals' brains and see what happens when we're processing language, there's been a huge amount of data showing subtle but significant cognitive advantages and linguistic advantages associated with bilingualism. Let me just show you some of these. These data are now being picked up by the mainstream media. This is an article from Time magazine a couple of years ago entitled How the Brain Benefits from Being Bilingual. If any of you want to see the French version, it's down at the bottom there. This is one from Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Bilingualism boosts the brain at all ages. Learning a second language pays off for more than communication. And these articles go on and on. Los Angeles Times, New York Times, you name it. So this knowledge is mainstream. And yet, you may bet that when the challenge to Proposition 227 comes up, we'll have a re-emergence of the know-nothings who will oppose this and say bilingualism is a problem for kids, despite the fact that all of the data shows that if we do not develop the knowledge, the language knowledge that children bring to school, we're contradicting, we're violating the very essence of the term education, which is to make children more than they were, to draw out their potential. There's, I picked out one study at random there by, I won't try and pronounce names because I'll probably fluff them, but this was a study where English-Spanish bilinguals and English-Mandarin bilinguals were compared to monolinguals in terms of how rapidly and quickly they could pick up an artificial language that none of them had ever seen before. And the conclusion was that the bilingual participants mastered nearly twice the number of words as the monolinguals. A colleague of mine in Toronto, Ellen Bialystok, has done some interesting research that I think is very relevant to everybody here. Namely that she looked at the onset of dementia, symptoms of dementia among elderly people, and she compared monolinguals and bi and multilinguals. And what she found was that the onset of symptoms of dementia were about 4 years later, 4 years delayed among the bi and multilinguals than in monolinguals. So everybody here can look forward to a bright future. Okay. The conclusion is that using 2 or more languages is good for your brains. Our brain is like a muscle. The more we use it, the more it develops. And bilinguals and multilinguals have more opportunity to process language, to figure out which language goes where, to become aware of language, and that helps our overall cognitive functioning. This is a diagram that I think was in that original paper back in 1981, which tries to sum up what the research is saying. It says one wheel or one language can get you place. So if you're monolingual, that's fine. So can a big wheel and a little wheel. If you've taken grade 12 Spanish, that's fine too. However, when your wheels are nicely balanced and fully inflated, you'll go further, provided, of course, the people who made the wheels knew what they were doing. And there's a history lesson in here. There's a history lesson in here, because when we look at the history of bilingualism in this country, in Canada, in Europe, in many parts of the world, what we see is a systematic pattern where dominant groups in the society have promoted this bottom model of bilingualism, where children have been punished for speaking their language in school. They've been made to feel ashamed of their language. Their mouths have been washed out with soap for uttering a word of Spanish in school. And when we look at this history and look at what the alternative is, and the alternative is so easy and so rational and so evidence-based, there is no excuse for schools, whether they're bilingual programs or monolingual programs, not to position students' knowledge of additional languages as an advantage, to communicate the fact that children who know other languages have an advantage, not only in their personal lives, they have an advantage in being able to speak with their grandparents who may not know English. They have an advantage in contributing to the intellectual capital of this country. And for schools to deny that is utterly unacceptable. The third point that I tried to make in that original article was that concerned the transfer effect across languages. And I used this diagram, the dual iceberg representation of bilingual proficiency, to try and get across what was happening here. This came about, actually. There's for me, an interesting story in relation to this. The first time I came to California was when a person whom some of you may be familiar with, Professor Margarita Calderon, called me up one February day. The snow was outside in my office in Toronto. It was 1979. I had an article that was published in the Review of Educational Research that some people in California had read and thought was interesting. And Margarita called me up and said, would you like to come down to California and talk about some of the issues that you've written about in the article? It was about -10 outside. The snow was falling. Everybody around me was miserable. Sunny California was beckoning. I didn't think twice. I remember getting off the plane in, I think it was Ontario, near Los Angeles, and walked off, and I was pretty young at that stage, had long hair, I was wearing jeans, and got into the terminal, looked around. There was 1 or 2 people standing around, but nobody seemed to be interested in saying hello to me. So I just hung around there, and then eventually this woman came over and said, "Are you Jim Cummins?" And it was Margarita, and I could tell from that moment on that she thought she had made a huge mistake. Anyway, that was my first introduction to California. Things kind of improved since then. But in that, in one of the sessions that I was involved in that first visit, there was a person called Roger Shai, who's a sociolinguist, and he had written about, or he'd used an analogy of language proficiency being like an iceberg, where what you see on the surface is only a small fraction of what's below the surface. The folks in the Titanic that we saw earlier on didn't know about this, but his point was that what we see in the surface are things like, basic vocabulary, pronunciation, fluency, things like that. But what's important for academic development is our knowledge of concepts, our knowledge of vocabulary, our ability to do different kinds of things with language, our ability to use language flexibly in a variety of contexts, etc. So it was about, 90 degrees outside. It was incredibly hot, which may have stimulated us to talk about icebergs. But it struck me that one could take that notion of language proficiency being an iceberg and talk about what bilingualism represented as a double iceberg, where even though the two surface features, the surface features of the two languages were separate, at a deeper underlying level, there was a lot of interdependence or overlap or commonality across the two languages. And this is what enabled transfer to take place. So this visual metaphor was something that I used to talk about interdependence and why it is that children who take half or more of their time through a minority language don't suffer in terms of their knowledge of the dominant language. The last point that I talked about in that original paper was, what do we know about bilingual education? Since that time, obviously, there have been many, many evaluations done in many countries around the world, and I'll just illustrate here one of them. This is from the conclusion of one of the articles in the report of the National Literacy Panel on Language Minority Children and Youth. Diane August and Timothy Shanahan were the editors of this. I would just enthusiastically recommend this book to any of you who have trouble sleeping. It will send you asleep in no time. It is 700 plus pages of turgid, small print prose that sums up and analyzes all of the research on bilingualism, bilingual education, literacy development among second language learners. But what I want to focus on is what they say about bilingual education. They reported in 2006, the panel was set up under the Bush administration, so it certainly was not a kind of a bleeding heart liberals who were involved in this. Their conclusion was that there's no indication that bilingual instruction impedes academic achievement in either the native language or English, whether for language minority students, students receiving a heritage language instruction, or those enrolled in French immersion programs, for example, in Canada. Where differences were observed, on average, they favored the students in a bilingual program. The meta-analytic results clearly suggest a positive effect for bilingual instruction that's moderate in size. Okay? Another report that came out in the same year by Fred Genesee and colleagues concluded pretty much the same thing. This is an article in that report by Lyndon Leary and Borsato, and they said there's strong convergent evidence that the educational success of English language learners is positively related to sustained instruction through the student's first language. Most long-term studies report that the longer the students stayed in the program, the more positive were the outcome. So when you meet people who are skeptical about the effects of bilingual education, who don't understand how you can dilute students' exposure to English and still have them do well in English, and even better than they're doing in an all-English program, recommend these books to them. And if they refuse to read them, then they do not deserve your respect. It's as simple as that. If people are so wedded to their ideological convictions and unwilling to engage in dialogue about what's best for children in this country, what's best in terms of developing the intellectual capital of the country, then we should not waste our time talking to them. If they refuse to dialogue, let's go on and work with people who are committed to equity, committed to excellence in education, committed to inspirational pedagogy. So 35 years have passed. I'm not wearing jeans, and this, I've got a tie, you know. What have we learned? Okay, first, there's a few things I want to highlight as being essential things that we've learned, but have not been implemented systematically in terms of the instruction of English learners. First of all, there's a huge amount of research that has been largely ignored, showing that access to print and literacy engagement is the strongest instructional variable predicting literacy achievement. Its effects are even stronger than the effects of socioeconomic status. Now, when measurement people, educational measurement people, find anything that beats out the effects of socioeconomic status, they get excited. And what the OECD and lots of other researchers have pointed out is that reading engagement is a stronger predictor of reading success than socioeconomic status. And yet we have not picked up on that, and we have not implemented it in our schools. Steve Krashen talked about some of this research for many, many years. His book, The Power of Reading, sums up a lot of this research up to the year 2004. Since that time, there's been a huge amount of additional research. We can no longer afford to ignore this research, because if we do, students will not get the kind of instruction that will enable them to develop sustained growth in reading comprehension. Secondly, we've learned that societal power relations are important. The way power is negotiated and has been negotiated historically in the wider society, and the way it's been reflected in teacher-student identity negotiation, those variables exert a major effect on the achievement of students from marginalized social groups. Students who come from social groups whose identities, whose cultural, language, religion have been devaluated and subordinated in the wider society experience disproportionate academic failure. We've known this for generations. And yet, we have not focused in the mainstream educational discourse on what we need to do to enable those students to engage academically. And one of the reasons for that is that when we talk about educational research, when we talk about educational policy, for many people, power is the equivalent of a dirty word. We don't like to admit that there are power relations operating in education. And yet we all know that they're there. They've been dramatically present historically. They're more subtly present these days. If we don't address these issues, then we will not have turnabout schools. We will not close the achievement gap. And so maximizing students' literacy engagement and creating opportunities for students to use language, both their first language and their second language, in powerful, identity-affirming ways are crucial components of effective instruction. Let me try and just elaborate on that. So going back to what I said earlier on, a rational, evidence-based approach to policymaking must ask three questions. Which groups of students underachieve? Why do they underachieve? What causal factors are operating? And what high-impact, evidence-based educational interventions are available? It's incredible, but these questions have not been asked in a systematic way. And the consequence of this is that we've had a patchwork of initiatives that focus on one or two of the groups that have been underachieving, but have not been integrated in any systematic way. This is a diagram that's from a book that Margaret Earley and I recently wrote called Big Ideas for Expanding Minds. And it's got three different groups there: linguistically diverse students, EL students, students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, and students who are coming from groups that have marginalized status in the wider society. It tries to lay out some of the sources of potential disadvantage, and then what are some of the evidence-based instructional responses. So, as I said, if we have students who are coming to school not speaking the language of instruction and the school does nothing to help them, they will probably not do well academically. What the data suggests is that All teachers need to know how to scaffold comprehension and production of language across the curriculum. One of the major ways of doing that, where it's feasible, is through bilingual education. And then we need to reinforce academic language across the curriculum, again, ideally in both languages. If we're talking about students from low socioeconomic backgrounds, there's been a massive amount of research done in this country and elsewhere about some of the causes underlying the underachievement of low socioeconomic status. So things like inadequate prenatal care, inadequate nutrition, housing segregation, lack of cultural and material resources in the home due to poverty, the possibility that there may be a limited range of language interaction going on in the home, possibly because both parents are working, or maybe single-parent families where the mother is working, so there isn't the same range of interaction happening. And then inadequate access to print in home and school. And this has been documented in several studies done by people like Nell Duke and others, that students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds tend to have less access to print in their homes. There are very few libraries in the communities public libraries in the communities that they're growing up in, and the schools that they attend tend to be much less rich in terms of their literacy resources than students attended by more affluent students. What this implies, if we want to address the underachievement of low socioeconomic status students, is that we need to focus on maximizing students' literacy engagement and, again, reinforcing language across the curriculum. Schools can't do very much about things like housing segregation, but what we can do is address the fact that students may not have adequate access to print in their homes. And there's, as I said, a huge amount of research that has not been picked up adequately in terms of this. If we look at students from marginalized status backgrounds, as I said, there's been a pattern of societal discrimination, low teacher expectations, stereotypes that students are not going to do well academically, and a general pattern of identity devaluation. This is all part of the historical record. What this implies for what we do is we've got to connect instruction to students' lives and affirm student identities in association with literacy engagement. I'm just going to skip this, but basically what this is saying is that we've had different groups of researchers focusing on each of these three patterns. We all know people who've worked on issues related to English learners and bilingual students. Many of them are here in this room or at this conference. The people who've worked on issues related to low socioeconomic status are people like David Berliner, Robert Rothstein, Linda Darling-Hammond, and others. But they are not insiders in areas related to language, and they're not necessarily insiders in areas related to underachievement of students from marginalized social backgrounds. And then we have a strong focus among many researchers focusing on critical pedagogy, and culturally responsive or culturally relevant instruction. But again, that work hasn't always picked up on what we know about causes of underachievement among low socioeconomic status students or from students from non-English speaking backgrounds. Here's a diagram which I'll just talk briefly about. This is my attempt to put the research, the main areas of the research, into a fairly simple framework, where what it's saying is that the strongest predictor of literacy achievement is the extent to which students get access to print and become actively engaged in literacy. What that means is that from the day a student walks into the Head Start program, the day a student walks into kindergarten, he or she should be surrounded by books. They should be listening to stories being read by the teacher. The teacher will dramatize these stories, get students excited. The students may dramatize aspects of the stories. The teacher will start teaching reading strategies long before students have started to the process of decoding. For example, a teacher may be reading a story, something like Little Red Riding Hood, and dramatizing it, getting students engaged, pointing out vocabulary through the pictures, and then she may stop and say, "What do you think is going to happen next?" That's teaching the reading strategy of prediction long before students have started to read. So what I'm talking about here is literacy as a pattern of socialization, and where students have not had the opportunity to have this socialization process in their homes for the reasons that I've mentioned, the school has got to do it. Instead, what No Child Left Behind did, and what Reading First did, was to penalize school districts and schools that wanted to expose children to literacy. In New York City, the Reading First panels initially refused to give the city $44 million of Reading First funds because the phonics program that they were using, which was a program called Month by Month Phonics, so it was focused directly on phonics, but it also had classroom libraries. And it also focused on helping children to start writing as a way to hypothesize about sound-symbol relationships. That wasn't scientifically proven according to the panel. And so the policies that were implemented were diametrically opposed to what the research is saying about what leads to strong literacy development. If we look at what we need to do to get students engaged with literacy, we need to scaffold meaning. All teachers need to know how to do that. We need to be able to differentiate instruction for all the students who are in a class. We need to connect to students' lives. We need to affirm identities, and we need to extend students' focus on language across the curriculum. And I'll elaborate on these in the session that comes after this. As I said before, there's general agreement about the importance of scaffolding. There's general agreement about the importance of activating students' prior knowledge. There's general agreement about the importance of extending students' knowledge of language, focusing explicitly on language. This is part of the Common Core State Standards. But print access and literacy engagement have been largely neglected in policies and practice. In the interest of time, I'm going to just quickly go through a few slides and then just wrap up. What I want to point out here in terms of the OECD studies, their PISA studies, Program for International Student Assessment. They've been doing these for about 15 years. The OECD is a big international think tank focused on economics. They're interested in education because education supplies the input to the economic process. Now, many of you may not have defined your identity as educators as providing the input to the economic process, but that's the way the OECD looks at it. And so they're concerned about elevating the quality of products that come out of the education system. And one of the things that they've found, as I said, is that reading engagement is a stronger predictor of reading success than socioeconomic status. And secondly, there's about a 1/3 overlap between the effects of reading engagement and socioeconomic status, suggesting that if we were to get students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds actively engaged with reading from an early stage, then we could potentially push back about 1/3 of the negative effects of socioeconomic status on students' achievement. This is huge. This is a huge impact. And yet, because of ideological narratives that have afflicted some in the research community, that have afflicted policymakers operating within No Child Left Behind, the data relating to literacy engagement has been largely suppressed. This is a meta-analysis by a person called Jim Lindsay, again showing that increasing children's access to print appears to produce more positive attitudes towards reading, increases the amount of reading that children do, increases their emergent literacy skills, and improves children's reading achievement. Okay, and let me just highlight, moving on to identity affirmation. A quote here from Gloria Ladson-Billings, I think, sums it up very, very clearly. She says, "The problem that African American students face is the constant devaluation of their culture, both in school and in the larger society." And if our bilingual students are attending schools that communicate to them that their language is not welcome within the school, that their culture is not welcome, you leave those things at the schoolhouse door. What is that if not devaluation? That is a denial of the rights of the child. So I think what we should be aiming for is inspirational pedagogy. That's a term that is hard to define, but it's a term that when we see it, we recognize it. It's like art. I know what I like. It'll involve school and literacy experiences that students are likely to remember throughout their lifetimes, and I'll talk about some of these in the session coming up. It's the kind of instruction that all of us would like or would have liked our own children to have received, where they come home from school excited about what they're doing. And when they're excited, they're going to be excited not about doing drill and practice activities for standardized tests. They're going to be excited because they're finding out new things, they're inquiring, They're using the totality of their brains. They're getting affirmation in the school context. So inspirational pedagogy would be characterized by classroom interactions that generate high levels of academic engagement, cognitive challenge, supplemented by appropriate support, identity affirmation, and then enabling students to use language to generate knowledge, to create literature and art, and act on social realities. And as I said, with Dylan Garrity's performance and his work earlier on, that we heard earlier on today, you've got an amazing example of how individuals can create literature, can create art, can act in social realities. And this is what we need to focus on with our own students. I'm going to leave. I was going to talk a little bit about Project Fresa, which happened in California a number of years ago. It's one of the outstanding examples of inspirational pedagogy that's out there. I'll leave that until later. I'd like to end up with a quote from a remarkable young woman who was involved in a project where Native Canadian students, First Nations high school students, worked with an elder to create art that reflected their identities, that reflected their culture, and this was a transformational process for them. Their work was displayed in 3 galleries, art galleries in the Southern Ontario region. Students wrote poems reacting to the art that their peers had written, and basically it was a process that had a profound effect on how students saw themselves. And First Nation students in the Canadian context have been characterized by large-scale dropout, not doing very well academically because of the brutal experiences that their communities have had from many generations in residential schools that set out to destroy identity. Here's what Cassandra Baisog said that I think is something that speaks to us all. She says, take away identity and what do you have? If you have a student that doesn't know who they are, do you think they care about what goes on in the classroom? When we look at this, the process of identity negotiation has to start from the day the student walks into school. It's much more profound in terms of whether students are going to engage academically or withdraw academically. And if it doesn't start when students enter school, it may be too late to start it at the high school level. And so if students come to school already bilingual or coming from a language background other than English where they're potentially bilingual or emergent bilingual, if the school does not communicate to that child, whether it's a bilingual program or a monolingual program, if the school does not communicate to that child that their language talents represent an accomplishment, an intellectual accomplishment that they should be proud of, then we are not educating students. If the school does not provide students with the opportunity to use both their languages, all of their linguistic talents, powerfully to generate knowledge, to create literature and art, then we're not educating students. And so what we're talking about here is not just student identity, but teacher identity. We're talking about the identities of everybody in this room. When all of us walk into classrooms on a Monday morning, okay, sometimes we may say, what am I doing here? But that's a serious question. We should be asking ourselves that question because our own identities as educators are scripted in the interactions that we generate with our students. And if we're not clear about our own identities as educators, we're not going to do a good job. And so what Cassandra says about students, if a student doesn't know who they are, there's a problem there. If we as educators don't know what we stand for, there's a problem. And so when we see our role as educators, as affirming students' identities, as enabling students to be the most that they can possibly be, what we're doing is not just an interpersonal process between ourselves and students, it's also a societal process, because we're challenging patterns of coercive relations of power that have characterized the relationships between dominant groups and subordinated groups over generations. And unless we see ourselves in that role as willing to focus on creating context of empowerment for our students, we're not going to do a good job. Now, the response that some people might say, well, you know, if I go to a job interview and the principal's interviewing me and he or she asks me, you know, what do you see as your major role as an educator? And I respond, you know, I see my role as challenging coercive relations of power. I might not get the job. So if you wear a t-shirt with that logo on it, turn it inside out, but keep it close to your heart. Thank you. Thank you.